The Zephyrian research vessel Gentle Current moved slowly through the dark space between stars. Its bioluminescent hull glowed with soft blue and green lights that pulsed like a heartbeat. Captain Veltar stood on the bridge watching the stars through the transparent dome above his head. His 4 delicate arms moved gracefully as he checked the ship's systems. The Zephyrians were beautiful creatures with translucent skin that showed the flow of their silver blood beneath. They had large, dark eyes that could see colors humans had never dreamed of. Veltar felt peaceful as he always did during deep space travel. His people had been exploring the galaxy for thousands of years, but they had never found anything that threatened them. The Zephyrians came from a world called Zephyr Prime, where the weather was always gentle and no creature had ever learned to hunt another. They had evolved without fear, because their world had given them no reason to be afraid. Even their technology reflected this peaceful nature. Their ships were grown rather than built using living materials that could heal themselves when damaged. The peace ended when the sensors detected 3 large ships approaching fast. Lieutenant Cassara at the sensor station called out with worry in her melodic voice. The ships were not in any database the Zephyrians had. They were made of dark metal and covered with sharp angles that looked aggressive even from a distance. Veltar ordered his crew to send a greeting message on all frequencies. The response came back harsh and demanding. The voice that answered spoke in rough tones through the universal translator. It belonged to Captain Graxtor of the Korthak Raider clan. The Korthaks were larger than most species with thick gray skin and brutal faces. They had evolved as scavengers on a world where the strong took from the weak. Graxtor demanded that the Zephyrians surrender their ship and prepare to be boarded. He wanted their advanced technology and anything else of value they might be carrying. Veltar tried to explain that they were peaceful researchers with nothing worth stealing. The Zephyrians had no weapons because they had never needed any. Their most dangerous tool was a geological scanner used to study planets from orbit. Graxtor laughed at this and told them they had 10 minutes to surrender, or his ships would open fire. The Korthak weapons were crude but effective against unshielded civilian vessels. The Zephyrian crew looked to their captain with trust in their large eyes. They had never faced violence before and did not know how to respond. Veltar felt the weight of their lives on his shoulders. He knew that surrender would mean slavery or death for his people. The Korthaks were known throughout this region of space as pirates who showed no mercy to those they captured. Veltar made the only decision he could. He ordered his communications officer to send out a distress signal on all emergency frequencies. The message was simple and desperate. They were peaceful researchers under attack by pirates and needed immediate help from any friendly forces in the area. The signal was aimed toward the Altarian system, where the peacekeeping force maintained a patrol base. The Altarians were known as gentle mediators who solved problems through talking rather than fighting. They had helped many species resolve conflicts over the years. Veltar hoped they would respond quickly with negotiators who could convince the Korthaks to leave. What he did not know was that a solar storm in the nearby system had changed the path of his message. Instead of reaching the Altarians, the signal traveled much further through subspace. Hours passed as the Korthaks grew more impatient. Graxtor kept extending his deadline, but his threats became more violent each time. He described in detail what his crew would do to any Zephyrians they captured alive. The pirates began moving closer and powering up their weapons systems. Veltar could see the fear in his crew's faces as they waited for help that might never come. The distress signal continued its journey through the twisted paths of subspace. It traveled for days, passing by empty systems and dead worlds. Finally, it reached the outer edge of a system that most civilized species avoided. The Galactic Survey had marked this system as extremely dangerous. The 3rd planet was listed as a death world where conditions were so harsh that no intelligent life could possibly survive. The signal was picked up by a monitoring station in orbit around this unlikely world. The station was called Liberty Base, and it served as the headquarters for something called the United Earth Defense Fleet. A human named Admiral Jake Morrison was in his office reviewing patrol reports when the communication came in. Morrison was an older man with gray hair and scars on his face from old battles. His blue eyes were sharp and intelligent, but they could turn cold as ice when he was angry. Morrison listened to the translated message with growing fury. The universal translator struggled with some of the Zephyrian concepts, but the basic meaning was clear. Innocent civilians were under attack by pirates who threatened to kill them all. What the translator could not convey was that the Korthak weapons were roughly equal to human fireworks in terms of destructive power. To Morrison, this sounded like a heavily armed fleet attacking defenseless civilians. Within 1 hour, Morrison had assembled a response fleet. The battlecruiser New York would lead the mission, supported by 3 destroyers named Boston, Denver, and Phoenix. Each ship carried enough firepower to crack a planet's surface and turn its oceans to steam. The crews were all humans who had grown up on a world where everything from the weather to the smallest insects tried to kill them every day. Morrison walked through the corridors of Liberty base as his fleet prepared to launch. The other officers he passed nodded with respect. They all knew his reputation from the Centauri border wars, where he had earned his scars fighting alien invaders. Morrison had lost good friends in those battles, and he hated pirates almost as much as he hated bullies who picked on those weaker than themselves. The human fleet launched from Liberty Base like avenging angels. Their ships accelerated to speeds that would have terrified the Korthaks if they had known such velocity was possible. Morrison sat in his command chair aboard the New York and studied the tactical display. He was planning how to save the innocent civilians, while making sure the pirates learned a lesson they would never forget. Away, Captain Veltar still waited on his bridge, hoping that someone had heard their call for help. He did not know that salvation was coming from the most unlikely source in the galaxy. The beings responding to their distress call came from a world so violent that it had forged them into the ultimate warriors. Yet these same warriors had also learned the value of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system with a flash of blue light that lit up the darkness. Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of the New York, watching the tactical display as his sensors swept the area. The battlecruiser was massive with thick armor plating and weapon ports that could unleash destruction beyond imagination. Behind him, the 3 destroyers Boston, Denver, and Phoenix took up defensive positions ready to support their flagship. Commander Lisa Parker sat in the captain's chair studying the sensor readings with professional interest. Parker was a veteran officer with short brown hair and steady hands that never shook even in combat. She had served under Morrison for 5 years and trusted his judgment completely. Her crew respected her because she never asked them to do anything she would not do herself. The bridge crew worked quietly at their stations as they analyzed what they were seeing. Lieutenant Ben Carter called out from the tactical station with confusion in his voice. The sensor readings showed 3 ships attacking a 4th, but something seemed wrong with the data. The attacking vessels were roughly the size of Earth patrol boats, and their weapons appeared to be mining lasers with very low power output. Carter ran the scans 3 times to make sure his equipment was working properly. He could not understand why the civilian ship did not simply outrun such slow attackers. What Carter did not know was that the speeds involved already terrified the Zephyrians beyond measure. The Korthak ships moved faster than anything the gentle aliens had ever imagined possible. To the Zephyrians, this was like being chased by lightning itself. Their elegant research vessel had never been designed for speed or combat. It was built for careful study of distant worlds and long, peaceful journeys between the stars. Captain Graxtor stood on the bridge of his flagship, Bone Crusher, enjoying the familiar thrill of intimidating helpless prey. The Korthak captain was larger than most of his species, with scars covering his thick gray hide. His ship was crude but functional, with weapons meant to blast through asteroid hulls and strip mining equipment. Graxtor had been raiding peaceful vessels for 20 years, and this looked like an easy prize. The celebration ended when his sensor operator reported 4 unknown contacts approaching at impossible speeds. The power signatures were unlike anything in their databases, showing energy outputs that made their instruments scream warnings. When the human fleet moved into visual range, the Korthaks saw ships that looked like they were designed by beings who considered overwhelming force to be just the starting point for any conversation. The New York alone was 3 times larger than all 3 Korthak ships combined. Its hull bristled with weapon systems that glowed with barely contained energy. The destroyers looked small only in comparison to their flagship, but each one carried enough firepower to level a city. Every line of their construction spoke of controlled violence and casual lethality. These were ships built by people who had learned that the best way to keep peace was to be prepared for war. Captain Parker opened a communication channel to all ships in the area. Her voice was calm and professional as she delivered a message that would become legend among both species. She told the unknown vessels attacking the civilian craft that they had 30 seconds to withdraw, or they would be destroyed. The words were simple but carried the absolute confidence of someone who had faced far worse threats and lived to tell about it. The universal translator conveyed her words to both the Zephyrians and the Korthax, but it could not capture the casual certainty in her tone. This was not a threat or a bluff, but simply a statement of fact delivered with the same calm precision she might use to report the weather. Parker had dealt with pirates before and knew that most of them were cowards who only attacked those weaker than themselves. Captain Veltar heard the transmission and felt both relief and terror wash through his slender frame. Relief that someone had finally answered their distress call, and terror at the barely restrained violence he could sense in the newcomer's words. These beings spoke of destruction with the same casual tone his people might use to discuss adjusting their course by a few degrees. The power readings from their ships made his instruments display error messages because the numbers were beyond their ability to calculate. The Zephyrian crew gathered around their captain, looking for guidance in this impossible situation. They had called for help and received what appeared to be 4 vessels of unimaginable destructive capability. Veltar tried to understand what kind of species could build such ships and still choose to help strangers. Everything about the newcomers suggested they were predators of the highest order, yet they had responded to a cry for help from complete strangers. Graxtor stared at his own sensor displays, convinced that his equipment must be malfunctioning. The power outputs he was seeing belonged in ancient legends about the Star Killers who had supposedly ruled the galaxy in the distant past. No modern species possessed such devastating capabilities. The idea that he had just threatened beings who could casually destroy entire fleets made his blood run cold with fear he had not felt since childhood. The Korthak captain tried to maintain his composure as he studied the human ships. Their design was completely alien to anything he knew, but clearly focused on one purpose. Every weapon port, every armored plate, every glowing energy conduit was arranged for maximum destructive efficiency. These ships had been built by engineers who understood that sometimes the only language pirates respected was overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. Parker checked her chronometer and noted that 20 seconds had passed since her ultimatum. She had given the attackers fair warning, which was more than they deserved, but her training demanded that she follow proper first contact protocols. The defense fleet had learned through bitter experience that clear communication could prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Most conflicts could be resolved through demonstration of superior force rather than actual violence. The human crew waited patiently for the pirates to make their choice. They had confidence in their weapon systems and their training, but hoped the situation could be resolved without firing a shot. These humans had grown up on a world that taught them violence was sometimes necessary, but never to be undertaken lightly. They understood that with great power came great responsibility, and that true strength lay in knowing when not to use the weapons they carried. 10 seconds remained on Parker's ultimatum as both alien species tried to understand what they were facing. The Zephyrians saw salvation arriving in the form of beings whose casual mention of planetary destruction suggested they commanded forces beyond imagination. The Korthak saw death approaching in ships that radiated menace like miniature suns. Neither species understood that they were looking at humans who simply wanted to help innocent people and go home safely to their families. The 30 seconds passed in tense silence as everyone waited to see what the Korthaks would choose. Captain Graxtor felt the eyes of his crew upon him as he stared at the impossible ships on his display screen. His reputation among the raider clans depended on never backing down from a fight. He had built his career on intimidating weaker species and taking what he wanted by force. The idea of retreating now would destroy everything he had worked for. Graxtor made the decision that would seal his fate and change the balance of power in this region of space forever. He opened a communication channel and broadcast his response with all the bluster he could manage. His voice carried across the void, telling these newcomers that he was conducting legitimate salvage operations and that they should mind their own business. He claimed to represent the mighty Korthak raider clans and threatened them with terrible consequences if they interfered with his work. To emphasize his point, Graxtor ordered his gunners to fire warning shots near the human fleet. The Korthak weapons were designed for breaking up asteroids and scaring civilian ships. Their mining lasers could cut through rock and metal given enough time, but they were never meant to fight military vessels. The energy beams lanced out toward the human ships, glowing red in the darkness of space like angry fireflies. Lieutenant Carter watched the incoming fire with amazement rather than alarm. The tactical computer analyzed the energy output and reported that someone appeared to be shooting fireworks at them. The power levels were so low that the New York's defensive shields did not even activate automatically. Carter had to check his instruments twice to make sure he was reading the data correctly. These weapons would barely scratch the paint on a human patrol boat. Commander Parker listened to Carter's report with the patience of an adult watching children play with toy guns. She understood that the aliens probably considered their weapons to be quite powerful, but the energy levels involved were laughably inadequate. A single human infantry laser rifle carried more destructive potential than all 3 Korthak ships combined. Parker decided that a proportional response was called for to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. She turned to her weapons officer, Chief Petty Officer Mike Rodriguez, and gave him careful instructions. Rodriguez was a steady man with 20 years of military service who had never fired a shot in anger that was not absolutely necessary. Parker told him to fire a single warning shot from their smallest point defense laser, aimed well clear of all ships in the area. She wanted to demonstrate their capability without actually harming anyone. Rodriguez nodded and selected the appropriate weapon system. He chose one of the automated point defense turrets normally used for shooting down incoming missiles. The power setting was reduced to its absolute minimum, which by human standards was barely enough to be called a weapon at all. Rodriguez aimed the laser at empty space several kilometers away from the nearest ship and squeezed the trigger for exactly 1 second. The result was spectacular beyond anything either alien species had ever witnessed. The laser bolt illuminated the entire region of space like a miniature star being born. Its passage caused every sensor in the area to overload temporarily and briefly blinded anyone looking directly at the beam. The coherent light continued past the ships and struck a small asteroid that had been drifting nearby unnoticed by anyone. The asteroid simply ceased to exist. One moment it was a chunk of rock and metal the size of a building, and the next moment it was expanding plasma glowing white-hot as it dispersed into space. The vaporization was so complete that not even dust remained behind. The sheer amount of energy required to achieve such total destruction was beyond the calculation ability of either alien computer system. Aboard the Gentle, current Captain Veltar and his crew watched in stunned silence as they tried to process what they had just seen. Their mathematical minds immediately began calculating the energy requirements for such a feat. The numbers that resulted from their analysis were so large that their computers assumed calculation errors and kept asking for verification. If this was a warning shot using minimal power, what could these beings do when they were actually trying to destroy something? The Zephyrian sensors had recorded every detail of the laser discharge, and the data painted a terrifying picture. The energy output had been thousands of times greater than their most powerful research equipment. Yet the beings who fired it had done so with such casual precision that they had avoided hitting anything important while making their point perfectly clear. This level of controlled destruction suggested technology so advanced that it might as well have been magic. Veltar realized that they had accidentally contacted a species that treated the movement of fleets the way his people treated scheduling research expeditions. These beings possessed the power to shatter worlds, yet they had chosen to respond to a distress call from complete strangers. The implications were staggering and would change everything his people understood about the galaxy they lived in. The Korthaks had a very different but equally terrified reaction to the demonstration. Captain Graxtor stared at his sensor readings with growing horror as the full implications sank in. His ships combined could not generate 1% of the energy that had just been casually discharged as a warning. The ancient legend spoke of star killers who could destroy suns and crack planets with their terrible weapons. Graxtor had always assumed those were just stories told to frighten children. The 3 Korthak ships hung motionless in space as their crews tried to understand what they were facing. Every pirate in the region knew the stories about beings of unimaginable power who had once ruled the galaxy before mysteriously disappearing. Most raiders assumed they were myths created to explain ancient ruins found on dead worlds. The idea that such beings had returned and were now pointing weapons at them was almost too terrible to contemplate. Commander Parker waited exactly 30 seconds after the demonstration before opening communications again. Her voice carried across the void with the same patient tone she had used before, but now there was an edge of steel beneath the calm words. She told the Korthak ships that she did not like repeating herself, and gave them one final chance to withdraw immediately or face destruction. The choice was theirs, but she would not ask again. The silence that followed was deafening as three different species contemplated the future that hung balanced on the edge of a knife. The humans waited with professional patience for the pirates to make the smart choice. The Zephyrians prayed to their gentle gods that no more violence would be necessary. The Korthax faced the hardest decision of their lives, knowing that their next move would determine whether they lived to see another day. The response from the Korthak fleet came swiftly, but it was not what Commander Parker had expected. Two of the three raider ships immediately began powering up their hyperspace drives with desperate haste. Their captains had seen enough to know that discretion was the better part of valor when facing beings who could vaporize asteroids as a casual demonstration. The ships Bloodfang and Starripper began broadcasting surrender messages on all frequencies while their engines charged for emergency jump to hyperspace. Captain Graxtor watched his fellow raiders, preparing to flee with growing rage and humiliation. His entire reputation among the Korthak clans was built on his image as a fearless leader, who never backed down from anyone. If he retreated now, the story would spread throughout pirate territory within days. He would become a laughingstock among his own people, and other captains would challenge his authority. The loss of face would be worse than death in Korthak culture. Graxtor made the decision that would define the rest of his very short career as a pirate captain. He was convinced that no species could actually possess the kind of devastating power he had just witnessed. The demonstration must have been some kind of trick using hidden explosives or holographic projections. These newcomers were trying to scare him away from valuable salvage using special effects and empty threats. His pride would not allow him to be fooled by such obvious deception. The Bone Crusher turned toward the human flagship as Graxtor prepared to call what he believed was an elaborate bluff. He ordered his crew to charge the main mining laser to full power and target the largest enemy vessel. His gunners worked frantically at their stations, preparing for what they assumed would be a decisive battle. Graxtor opened a communication channel and announced his intention to destroy the Starkillers and prove they were nothing but cowards hiding behind fancy light shows. The main weapon of the Bone Crusher was a modified mining laser originally designed for cutting through asteroid hulls during salvage operations. The Korthax had retrofitted it with focusing crystals and power amplifiers that doubled its destructive output. When fired at full power, it could punch through the hull of most civilian vessels and disable their engines or life support systems. Graxtor considered it the ultimate weapon for dealing with stubborn prey who refused to surrender. The crimson beam lanced across space toward the New York, carrying all the destructive power the Korthax could bring to bear. The energy struck the battle cruiser's forward shields and was absorbed without causing even the slightest fluctuation in the ship's power grid. The human defensive systems were designed to handle weapons that could crack continents and boil away oceans. A mining laser barely registered as anything more than background radiation from a nearby star. On the bridge of the New York, Lieutenant Carter glanced at his instruments and noted a minor energy spike in the forward shield grid. The tactical computer classified it as cosmic background radiation and automatically filtered it out of the display. Carter did not even bother reporting the incident to Commander Parker, because his training taught him to focus on actual threats rather than censor ghosts and random energy fluctuations. Parker, however, had been watching the tactical display carefully and saw the Korthak attack clearly marked on her screens. The energy levels involved were pathetically small by human standards, but the intent was unmistakable. In human military doctrine, firing on a warship constituted an act of war regardless of how ineffective the weapons might be. The fact that their shields had easily absorbed the attack was irrelevant to the legal and moral implications. Parker felt her expression harden as she considered her options. The pirates had been given multiple chances to withdraw peacefully and had chosen violence instead. Her duty was clear according to both military regulations and common sense. She turned to Rodriguez at the weapons station and gave the order that would become legend among both alien species for generations to come. "Return fire," she said quietly. "Disable them." Rodriguez acknowledged the order and began selecting an appropriate weapon system for the task. He chose one of the secondary pulse lasers normally used for point defense against incoming missiles. The power setting was reduced to what he considered the absolute minimum necessary to disable the enemy vessel without destroying it completely. Rodriguez was a professional who took no pleasure in killing and always used the least force required to accomplish his mission. The targeting. Computer locked onto the Bone Crusher's engine section with mechanical precision. Rodriguez double-checked his calculations to ensure the beam would strike only the propulsion systems and avoid the crew compartments where living beings might be injured or killed. Human military doctrine emphasized the protection of civilian lives even when those civilians happened to be pirates who had just attacked them. The pulse laser fired for exactly 0.3 seconds, sending a coherent beam of energy across the void at the speed of light. To Rodriguez, it was like swatting a particularly annoying insect with a fly swatter. The energy output was thousands of times greater than anything the Korthax had ever encountered, but it represented less than 1% of the New York's total weapons capability. The beam struck its target with surgical precision and achieved exactly the result that had been intended. The rear quarter of the Bone Crusher simply vanished in a flash of superheated plasma as the ship's engines were completely vaporized, along with the surrounding hull sections. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut automatically as the vessel's artificial gravity failed, and atmosphere began venting into space. The ship's lights flickered and died as backup power systems struggled to maintain minimal life support for the surviving crew members. Captain Graxtor found himself floating weightless in the wreckage of his bridge, surrounded by sparking control panels and the groans of tortured metal. His ship was crippled beyond any hope of repair and completely at the mercy of the beings he had foolishly chosen to attack. The realization that he had just witnessed a demonstration of restrained force rather than maximum destruction slowly penetrated his shocked mind. The two fleeing Korthak vessels detected the destruction of their flagship's engines and immediately jumped to hyperspace without looking back. Their captains would spread word throughout the Raider territories about the terrifying Starkillers who had returned from ancient legend. Within days, every pirate in the sector would know that beings of unimaginable power were once again active in this region of space and that they showed mercy only to those wise enough not to test their patience aboard the Gentle. Current Captain Veltar and his crew watched the brief engagement with awe and terror. They had just witnessed a precision strike that defied everything they understood about warfare and technology. The humans had disabled an enemy vessel with such surgical accuracy that they had avoided killing anyone while demonstrating their overwhelming superiority. Such restraint in the face of such power spoke of a civilization that had learned wisdom along with strength. The hours following the brief encounter were filled with careful diplomacy and growing understanding between the humans and Zephyrians. Commander Parker followed standard humanitarian protocols by dispatching a boarding party to assist the disabled Korthak vessel. The humans approached the crippled Bone Crusher in a small shuttlecraft designed for rescue operations. Lieutenant Emma Walsh led the team of 6 Marines who wore full combat gear and carried medical supplies for treating wounded aliens. Walsh was a young officer with steady nerves and extensive training in first contact situations. She had joined the defense fleet because she believed in protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. The sight of the damaged Korthak ship floating helplessly in space reminded her why she had chosen this career. Even pirates deserved medical attention when they were wounded and defenseless. The boarding party entered through the Bone Crusher's emergency airlock and found a scene of controlled chaos. The ship's artificial gravity had failed completely, leaving the surviving crew members floating in zero gravity among broken equipment and emergency lighting. The Korthaks who saw the humans approaching reacted with terror that seemed completely out of proportion to the situation. They cowered away from the rescue team like children afraid of monsters from their nightmares. Captain Graxtor was found floating unconscious in the wreckage of his command center with a head injury from flying debris. When he regained consciousness and saw Lieutenant Walsh approaching with medical equipment, he began babbling incoherently about Starkillers and the return of the Death Gods. His crew members who were still conscious begged for mercy in voices that shook with genuine fear. They surrendered immediately and offered no resistance to the human boarding party. Walsh was puzzled by the aliens' obvious terror at her presence. She was trying to help them, but they acted as if she were some kind of mythical monster rather than a rescue worker. When she offered medical assistance to the wounded Captain Graxtor, he could barely speak coherently. He kept mumbling about ancient legends and beings who could destroy entire star systems with casual ease. The fear in his eyes was real and absolute. Meanwhile, Captain Veltar had requested permission to come aboard the New York to thank their rescuers personally. Commander Parker agreed to the meeting because she was curious about the species they had just saved. The cultural exchange that followed would reveal the enormous differences between their respective worlds and ways of thinking about life in the universe. Veltar arrived at the human flagship in a small shuttle that looked more like a work of art than a spacecraft. Its bioluminescent hull pulsed with gentle colors and its lines flowed like water frozen in motion. The Zephyrian captain wore an environmental suit that was transparent enough to show his elegant features and the silver blood flowing beneath his translucent skin. He moved through the corridors of the New York with obvious nervousness at being surrounded by so much controlled violence. The meeting between Veltar and Parker took place in the ship's main conference room, which had been decorated with earth, plants and artwork to make it feel more welcoming. Parker wore her dress uniform and tried to put their alien visitor at ease, but Veltar remained visibly uncomfortable throughout their conversation. Everything about the human vessel spoke of casual lethality and overwhelming destructive power held in careful check by disciplined minds. When Parker offered to give Veltar a tour of the ship, he politely declined after catching a glimpse of the weapons bay through an open doorway. The sight of energy cannons larger than his entire shuttlecraft convinced him that prolonged exposure to such concentrated destructive power might be harmful to his health. Parker understood his reaction and did not press the issue. She had dealt with peaceful species before and knew they often found human military hardware disturbing. The conversation between the two captains was educational for both sides as they learned about each other's worlds and cultures. Parker discovered that the Zephyrians had evolved on a planet so gentle that their concept of extreme weather involved light breezes and temperature changes of just a few degrees. They had never developed weapons because they had never encountered anything in their environment that required violent solutions to problems. Veltar learned that humans came from a world that actively tried to kill its inhabitants on a daily basis through weather that could level cities, predators that hunted for sport, and diseases that could wipe out entire populations. The patrol fleet that had responded to their distress call was considered a minor force by human standards. What the Zephyrians saw as overwhelming power was just routine peacekeeping equipment to the defense fleet. The cultural exchange continued over several days as the human fleet escorted the gentle current to the nearest Zephyrian station. Word of the encounter spread rapidly through both species' communication networks, but with vastly different interpretations of what had actually happened. The humans filed it as a routine first contact situation, with a minor peacekeeping action, while the aliens saw it as a meeting with beings of godlike power. To the Zephyrians, the humans represented the ultimate protectors who possessed the power to destroy planets but chose instead to use that power to defend the innocent. Requests for formal alliance and protection agreements began flooding Earth's diplomatic channels within weeks of the first reports reaching Zephyrian space. The gentle aliens wanted the humans as allies and guardians against the darker forces that existed in their region of the galaxy. To the Korthax and other aggressive species in the area, the story became a cautionary tale about the return of the legendary Starkillers. These ancient beings were said to possess such terrible power that even their mercy was a form of devastating judgment upon those who opposed them. Piracy and raiding in the sector dropped to nearly zero as word spread about what had happened to Captain Graxtor and his fleet. For the humans, the entire incident was filed as a routine patrol report with a minor footnote about successful first contact procedures. Admiral Morrison included it in his weekly summary to Earth Command as evidence that their peacekeeping protocols were working exactly as intended. The crews of the responding ships received standard commendations for completing a rescue mission without unnecessary loss of life on either side. The alliance between Earth and the Zephyrian Republic became one of the strongest partnerships in that sector of the galaxy. It was built on mutual respect and the understanding that sometimes the best way to keep peace was to be prepared for war. The humans gained valuable scientific knowledge from Zephyrian research, while the gentle aliens received protection from those who would exploit their peaceful nature. Captain Veltar included a final observation in his official report to the Zephyrian High Council that would be quoted by historians for generations to come. He wrote that they had called for help and received salvation from beings who treated the movement of battle fleets as casually as his people scheduled research expeditions. Perhaps he concluded the universe's greatest mercy was that such overwhelming power existed in the hands of those who truly understood the value of restraint.